Well, last Sunday morning, it was Easter morning, and what a morning it was here at United Lutheran Church. It was abundant and joyful worship. The choir sang for us with skill. The altar guild decorated our sanctuary beautifully. Brass and timpani accompanied the choir and the congregational singing. And together we rejoiced in the good news and the mystery of our faith, that Jesus, who was crucified, is risen and lives now to give new life. On Easter evening at our house, after a nap and some ham, our family got together to watch the new production of the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar on NBC. Now, for years, every Holy Week, we have listened to the soundtrack from this classic Andrew Lloyd Webber production. Our son, now an adult, has every lyric and musical interval memorized. And so it was with much anticipation that we'd been counting down the days to see the new rendition of this classic. They had promoted all of the big names: John Legend as Jesus, Sarah Burrell as Mary Magdalene, and Alice Cooper as Herod. Really. In our estimation, it lived up to the hype. We loved it. But I read later that many religious people did not like Jesus Christ Superstar. They didn't like it then, and they didn't like it now. And while I think religious people find, well, quite a few things to object to in this production, most people say that their primary objection to it is that it ends with the crucifixion and doesn't include the resurrection. Now, the new NBC version, as I saw it, hinted at the resurrection with its spectacular conclusion, but the closing scene is crucifixion, not the resurrection. Well, there's reasons for this. On Good Friday, even the church doesn't tell the story of the resurrection. We pause so that we can meditate on the cross, on Jesus' death, his sacrificial gift of love. And the production Jesus Christ Superstar sets out to tell the story of the final days of Jesus' life, nothing more. But I wonder if a part of the reason that a big Broadway production includes the crucifixion of Jesus but not the resurrection is because it's just harder to know what to do with the resurrection. We can all get a handle, I think, on the story of a courageous rabbi who teaches great truth, reaches out to the least and the last of this world, and who is finally tragically put to death by the powers of this world, both religious and political, who are threatened by him, threatened enough to make sure they find a permanent solution to the problem. I think it's harder for all of us to really get a hold of, to fathom the truth and the power of Jesus' resurrection. I mean, just look at those first disciples. At the point in John's story where our gospel reading for today begins, 2 of the disciples have already been to the empty tomb. Mary Magdalene had told the disciples that very morning, "I have seen the Lord." But where are the disciples in the wake of that announcement and evidence? Well, they're hidden away behind locked doors, full of fear and doubt. It isn't easy for us to live the reality of Easter. There's a story of 2 children who were playing together while watching a movie on TV about Jesus' life. And the television was on in the background while they were playing. One of the children was a Christian, grew up in the church, and went to Sunday school. The other child was not. And as the movie on TV reached the point of Jesus' crucifixion, the second child became more and more interested in what was happening and very engaged in the program on TV and stopped playing. And the first child, frustrated by that, looked at the TV and said, never mind that, it's fine. He gets out of it in the end. And maybe that's something of how we end up feeling too. The resurrection is a happy ending to a sad story. He gets out of it in the end. But what does that have to do with me? Last Sunday was beautiful, but this week, well, the world and my life seem much the same. More winter, taxes to pay, relentless routines, and more stress and pain than most of us know what to do with. In the gospel reading for today, the risen Jesus shows up to 10 disciples and then to Thomas. And he teaches them and he teaches us something about what it means to live into the new reality of Jesus' resurrection. The disciple Thomas wasn't with the disciples, the rest of the disciples, the first time that Jesus appeared to them. And we're not told where Thomas was or what he was doing, but my best guess is he was out there getting on with his life, figuring out what was next. Whatever his reasons were, the next time that the risen Jesus steps through their locked doors, Thomas is with them. The risen Jesus surprisingly doesn't shame any of the disciples for the ways that they've failed him. And there were plenty. Denial, betrayal, desertion, hiding away in fear. Instead, before he can even ask, Jesus graciously invites Thomas to put his hands in his side and in his hands. Jesus greets his disciples with peace, and he breathes his risen Spirit onto them. I can't imagine that's what any of them were expecting. And his breath of peace and forgiveness and new life is the inauguration of a new Easter reality. From this point forward, God's grace and love alone will define our relationship with God. Not even death can keep God's love from us. And Jesus asks us to trust in that. There's something else interesting in this gospel reading to me this week. And that is, did you notice that the risen Jesus still bears the scars of Good Friday? Why does his risen body still have scars? His body holds the worst of what has happened to him in his risen life. And I think that that's a visible sign for us that Easter doesn't mean that the old realities of struggle and pain and death disappear, or that we don't have to worry about them anymore because everything is going to turn out all right in the end. Rather, Jesus' resurrection makes it possible for us to live not simply out of an old reality of sin and struggle and pain, but also in a new reality, the new reality of Easter. In other words, Easter isn't a break from the old reality or an escape from this world or the idea that the pain of our lives in this world don't matter because it all turns out okay in the end. Rather, Easter is the new reality that God's grace and kingdom and new life have already come into our lives in this world and are making us new, giving us new life, new possibilities, and new perspectives. So what? What does this new Easter reality mean for us? What does this new Easter reality look like? Well, I think there's as many answers to that question as there are people present here today and more. But for me, living Easter means that when I walk away from the grave of someone that I've loved, I do so knowing that there's nothing at all that has the power to separate us from the love of God and Jesus Christ. In life and in death, we are held in the embrace of a God who gives new life. God holds us in our living and in our dying and promises to never let us go. And for me, living Easter also means loving myself. To really love ourselves, I think, is a radical act in a world that constantly tells us that we're not enough and that we don't have enough and that we're always messing up. The risen Jesus loved his fearful and failed disciples. He forgave them. He breathed new life into them. He gave them his peace. Jesus invited Thomas in his absence and doubt to touch him. Paying attention to my needs guides me away from self-centeredness and fosters strength to care for the needs of others. And this week, Martin Luther King Jr. was a witness to me of what it means to live in this new Easter reality. This week, our nation remembered the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And on the night before he was murdered, King gave his "I have been to the mountaintop" speech. I read it this week, and in it, King said, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will reach the promised land." The resurrection of Jesus calls me to join in God's work of love and justice, empowered by the Easter reality that love will have the final word, that darkness does not overcome the light, and that death has been ultimately defeated. Resurrection is a new reality that's been brought into being in Jesus' death and resurrection. The resurrection connects our lives to a much bigger narrative, the story of what God is up to in the world. Resurrection points to the promise of new life and unconquerable love, even in the midst of the world's mess. The resurrection calls me to care for the real embodied needs of my neighbors. The resurrection whispers to me that I am deeply loved in my imperfection, but also reminds me that it's actually not about me. Still, our bodies bear the signs of our suffering. Still, the winters of our lives last longer than we had hoped. Too often, the powers of sin seem to have the upper hand and destroy God's prophets of love and justice. To live Easter is to know that despite all that, Easter living begins now. Amen.